it's always the kindness. It's always the kindness of others. So this morning, it is the kindness of Nico at Tushita to first invite me here. I also would like to thank Renuka ji, Kabir ji, Minoti ji is here. There are so many old Tushita family here. And Tushita is an extremely blessed center. And also my Chola Leksomla, who ordained with me, is here. And there are many of you online. So Tushita is a very, very special place, and it's a great honor for me to have this invitation. Actually, I have no real loci standing to be here, but then due to the kindness of Geshe Doji Damdolla suggesting my name, and this particular set of talks, actually, it might be interesting also for a Tushita audience, because in a way, this is material that I have taught to my university students. I shared this last time. And so actually, today also, I would like everyone to keep the perspective on some of the questions that they had, that if you don't accept these, if you're not, coming already to Tushita or another Dharma center, or you already engaging with these questions, what kind of things occur to you? So with that, before we start though, I would like to just, set our proper motivation. So here we are here to try and remove our afflictions, our cognitive obscurations, and quickly become enlightened beings for the benefit of all sentient beings. So I will just say one or two prayers, just Sangye chodang sogi chognam la, jangcho badu dagni kapso chi, dagi jinso gipe soknam ki, dola fencher sangye du par shok. Sangye chodang sogi chognam la, jangcho badu dagni kapso chi, dagi jinso gipe soknam ki, dola fencher sangye du par shok. Sangye chodang sogi chognam la, jangcho badu dagni kapso chi, dagi jinso gipe soknam ki, dola fencher sangye du par shok. And all sentient beings, until we reach enlightenment, go for refuge to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. By my accumulations of the practices of giving and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I and all sentient beings, until we reach enlightenment, go for refuge to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. By my accumulations of the practices of giving and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I and all sentient beings, until we reach enlightenment, go for refuge to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. By my accumulations of the practices of giving and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all beings have happiness, the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they have equanimity, free from excessive attachment to some and excessive hatred for others. And may they have everlasting happiness without being parted from it. So with that, just to recap what we were discussing last time. So the title of this series of chats is Competition and Cowardice, Compassion and Courage, Cognitive Change for a Happier Life. So really last time we talked about competition in the context of two particular disciplines, economics, mainstream neoclassical economics, and how they modeling of an abstract being who is self-interested, utility maximizing, and is always competing in various fronts, what that, how economics posits human nature. Let's put that in short. And it's not something that is in the classroom or that is only of interest for economic students or those who are also in, policy making or anything. Actually, because of interdependence, we are all today in a world which is conditioned in a way by the asymmetric power that this discipline has exerted. So if we think about inequality today at a global level, at a country level, inter, all of that, in a way, we can put a lot of that at the doorstep of economics as a discipline. So we spoke about that. And the fact is, I also then presented the frontier of many substreams of economics now, and many economists starting with also Amartya Sen, who got the Nobel, Indian, who has challenged this in various ways. He came up with a capability approach. He talked about income being a means to an end. And we see that in behavioral economics and many other substreams now, you have a lot of questioning of this positing of a very, very, one might say, gross kind of, in the sense of very coarse kind of a, human motivation, a human, inclination, and all of that. And then, of course, we talked about evolutionary biology. We talked about Darwinian notions of survival of the fittest. We said actually that was a misattribution. It's actually his student who coined, not student, but one of his great, initial supporters, Herbert Spencer, who actually, coins this term, who thought that, capitalism was coming and it was going to be where the world stopped. And in many ways, at that time, at the turn of the century, you actually had the rise of the state and communism. And so in a way, his theory, his grand theory of the world did not come true. But we talked about, even within now the frontiers of biology, of neuroscience, of primatology, many other disciplines, there is now an increasing sense that, actually compassion and other factors may be as much of a innate part of our human nature, and B, actually be better for our long-term survival. So how cooperation and societies with trust, and we can take this at multiple units, whether the unit of the country or the unit of the individual or the different units, So these are actually beneficial for us. And in any case, it's not true that, all of human nature is innately selfish and inclined towards self-interest. So we left it at that. And then we discussed about, why His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, has been so keen to bring up the notion of secular ethics or universal ethics. And these are ethics that are basically, based on our common human understanding, our experience, and also science, or a scientific understanding. Because he says that, religion is like the tea to the water of a kind of a spiritual or a basic values kind of framework that we all share. And today, I'm going to go into now the second part of the talk, which the first part was about competition and cowardice in a way, I would say even intellectual laziness, because we also accept and we've deeply internalized, I think, in modern education systems, this notion of competition. And of course, we also discussed last time that we cannot escape a structural system, right, which is imposed in a way globally, within countries, within our education systems, within our professional systems, and all of life, really. And we also a little bit discussed the definition of competition and how that makes us feel, because it's not a win-win game. The actual definition talks about, competing with others and winning over them and, beating them in some senses. So we also discussed how that makes you feel. So now today, this part is going to look at compassion as a universal ethic. And here, I think the English language, sometimes we ourselves are all, due to our colonial past, also English is our primary language, you could say. And at some points, it doesn't really convey the depth of meaning. And it brings to mind a different kind of an isolate, but that's what we have. And I'm going to talk about that, a little bit more. So first, I would like to, just start by this great Nalanda master, Acharya Chandrakirti, whose text, Entering the Middle Way, is really all about wisdom. I mean, the key part is about wisdom. But at the start, he pays homage to compassion. And he says that compassion alone is seen as the seed of a victor's rich harvest, as the water that nourishes it, and as the ripened fruit that is the source of long enjoyment. Therefore, at the start, I praise compassion. So he's composed this amazing text on emptiness, and we will talk about that a little bit in the next last session. But at the beginning, he starts with praising compassion. And he says that this is important in the beginning of your journey as the seed, as the initial seed that is going to, give rise to some qualities of compassion and, other virtues. In the middle, it's seen as important because it nourishes all the six perfections and all the other kind of virtuous activities that anyone may be trying to accomplish. And at the end, it is also important that whatever the ripened fruit is that, is for the benefit of all beings. So therefore, compassion is central. This morning, I got a bit late, and that's why I had to rush here, the flying nun, because I was just randomly got a forward. His Holiness was actually consecrating. He was in the main temple in Dharamsala. This is a picture of him at age 2, I think, and his enthronement ceremony. He is now this year by the Tibetan calendar going to be 90. I put him down here as, I think, the world's foremost ambassador of compassion. And I say this because, his own life has seen incredible hardship, and not just for himself, but for all the Tibetan people. And this is something he has, still dealing with. And yet he has displayed, a commitment to universal ethics and and compassion that we do not see in many world leaders today. So out of his 4 commitments, universal ethics is the first one. The others are, of course, interreligious harmony, the culture, survival, preservation of Tibetan culture, language, all of that. And now lately also the Nalanda Indian wisdom tradition. So this morning he was, basically they were reciting the mantra of the Buddha of compassion. And I'm very sorry to the Tushita audience here who are very senior and long-term practitioners. And there could be a mix of an audience. So I'm really talking also for somebody who may never have been exposed to any philosophy, and then others who have spent decades. So my apologies there. So this, he was speaking about this, and he was saying that, Himalayan people and Tibetan people, we recite the Mani mantra, but actually the main thing is to understand the meanings, practice of compassion, of emptiness, which is wisdom, interdependence. And this is really central, because otherwise you are just parroting, the mantra, which so now he sets out these 2 pillars for universal ethics, and we may say secular ethics. So basically, it's just based here on 2 basic principles, and we will come back to this in the end. And the quest here is really for something that can be accepted by all without too much, debate. So first is the recognition of our common humanity, and what is a marker, in a sense, sentience, mind possessors, mammals, animals, all of us, anybody with a mind, sentient beings have this. The thing that we share is really a desire for happiness and to avoid suffering. And we will go into this a little bit deeper as to what we mean. These are 2 loaded terms, but at this point, we can just accept this as something, and we can check our own, we will do that later, exercise. And the understanding of interdependence as a key feature of human reality, including our biological reality as social animals, right? So I think in the last few days, if you were reading, The Guardian has had headline news about, climate change scientists. We are way beyond the 1.5 centigrade threshold. We are reaching the 3 degrees centigrade. So they are in despair. And they were talking about, very interesting, 1/5 of the females climate scientists are not having children because they feel the future is going to be so dire. So when we are talking about interdependence, and, economists love the phrase externality, and I could do a different lecture, but we have, economics has formally put the whole environmental question as an externality. It's just something that, we need to economically take account for. So if I'm taking your beautiful Amazon forest and I'm just like, as long as I pay for it and I put it into the equation, then it's fine, right? But it's not fine. And we are sitting in 2024 when it's absolutely not fine. But here we are saying that we are interdependent at every level, from technology to biology to economic to, COVID, we saw public health, every level. And whether we accept that or not is something, we need to think about a little more. So these two principles allow us to see our well-being then as bound inextricably with that of others. It is this, and he sets, now we can have a debate, and this question has come up in some previous Tibetan House conference, about values being relative, about, like, so for example, there are some communities, maybe cannibalism, something there could be. So we can debate a little bit about whether there can be something called completely universal values within that, framework. But overall, we can all agree that if we take these two principles of our common humanity, and by humanity, I was also going to include animals, so I feel we shouldn't take an anthropocentric approach. So all living creatures, and then also our interdependence. And let's see if we can accept these two principles, because if we can, then we can, take this a lot further. And that's why His Holiness is propounding this. He is not saying that, Buddhism says this. Here I want to just bring up Bertrand Russell, who, I love his books, and The Conquest of Happiness is something that he has written, 1930. And he's a rationalist, and he says that, in fact, the whole antithesis between self and the rest of the world disappears as soon as we have any genuine interest in persons or things outside ourselves. Through such interests, a man or woman comes to feel herself part of the stream of life, not a hard, separate entity like a billiard ball, which can have no relation with other entities except that of collision. All unhappiness depends on some kind of disintegration or lack of integration. There is disintegration within the self through the lack of coordination between the conscious and unconscious mind. There is lack of integration between the self and society, where the two are not knit together by the force of objective interests and affections. The happy man or woman is the man or woman who does not suffer from either of these failures of unity, whose personality is neither divided against itself nor pitted against the world. Such a man or woman feels themselves a citizen of the universe, enjoying freely the spectacle that it offers and the joys that it affords, untroubled by the thought of death, because she or he feels himself not, or herself not, really separate from those who will come after him. It is such profound, instinctive union with the stream of life that the greatest joy is to be found. So here we have, a philosopher and a rationalist, and look at his ideas, and I'm just juxtaposing them later with, what the notion of universal ethics and what His Holiness has set out. And he is very, very keen for universal ethics to percolate down deep into all education systems, schooling, and universities. So actually, the material that I'm presenting here is what I have taught in an academic setting for 3 years at a university level. And he has reasons for doing this, because as we'll come to discuss later, the youth of today, in the age of science and all, might require certain reasonings and everything to accept certain things. And then it's very, very important that, we can accept these things through reasoning, through our cognition, and through, then gaining very sound conviction. So human happiness, and I won't go into questions here, we can take them later, but, for those who are long students of Buddhist philosophy, I'll be talking about mundane happiness and all this, but human happiness or animal happiness is complex and mixes two quite different and largely independent states. So 2 levels of satisfaction. And again, here, I think the English terminology might be a little bit, but we just make do. So if we think about sensory level experiences, so sensory, eyes, nose, smell, taste, touch, all this. So these experiences give us a pleasurable feeling, and there is and let us accept that this is something we all want. Because here, I think the key is to gain conviction. We don't have to just accept something at face value. And I'm going to say why that's so important, because personally, I myself would not be convinced by something where I just have to be accepted, at a faith, or just you have to accept it. It's something that doesn't appeal to certainly my mindset as an academic person. And, so a certain basic minimum level of income health, good health, friendship, all these things contribute, right? So, all of us, we are going, if we went for a good meal after this, or, we in Delhi is going to get hotter if we enter a good room with air conditioning and all, fine. It's contributing to our pleasure, happiness, also, one could say, that's fine. And it is true. But equally, it is temporary, it is short term. And beyond the point, I'm not sure that Elon Musk or, in India, all the biggest, wealthiest people and all, I'm not sure that it is proportionate that their happiness is increasing with their wealth. And I want to remind you here that again, Amartya Sen, his foundational idea, he got the Nobel later, but this income being a means to an end. It is not an end in itself, right? Elon Musk is not deriving from happiness from his the dollars in his bank account, but it is, he sees as a means to an end, right? He does whatever in Mars and everything. So for all of us, and also the poorest person and everybody, right? So even what I'm trying to say here is that, there would be agreement across the space between somebody like, an economist like Amartya Sen, and a lot of thinkers like Bertrand Russell and all, and what His Holiness is saying here. This is from Beyond Religion, his book, and Beyond Religion, as you say. But if we think of a deeper level of mental satisfaction, which is then deriving not from external stimuli, but from our own mental state. And here, of course, this requires a degree of mental composure and training, I would say, and it is a longer term, more stable happiness. And here I would really like to give the example of one of the people who was incarcerated by the Chinese after 1959 in a prison for decades, right? And then finally he came out and into exile, and he was very aged by then, and he met His Holiness, and His Holiness asked him, how was it? And he said, I did feel a bit of danger at some points. And His Holiness said, what kind of danger? And he said, danger of losing my compassion. So now this kind of mental stability that I'm talking about, it does not depend on external stimuli. And in fact, it is completely, independent of it, as we can see in this example, at least at very high levels. And this is far more stable and long-term. And I think, so we need to balance our wish for these two kind of, And of course, for the latter, there are two other causal factors. And these, as I'm saying, is not my words. This is His Holiness in Beyond Religion. A sense of purpose which transcends narrow self-interest. I think even this might be backed up by studies now that older people, retired people and all this, right? If they have some sense of purpose, they are, actively involved in some things that means a lot to them. This really gives a lot of happiness of this longer term kind, And the other thing is of being connected to others or belonging to some kind of community, some kind of larger, And the root of both of these last two is compassion. At some level, this sense of purpose, which is going beyond your own narrow interests, that me, my family, my well-being, my this, my that, and something that, you are connection. After all, we are, social animals ourselves also. So I will just remind you again, we discussed this last time. What I love about Buddhist philosophy is the definitions. Because I just don't like anything little iffy, just here, just, loosely this and this. So this, very concrete, because you can then really pin down and think about some things in a very systematic way. I personally really love that. So compassion is a mental factor of love or affection, which wishes others to be freed of suffering and the causes of suffering. And loving kindness is the flip side of the coin, and we'll see that later on. So it is a mental factor of love and affection as well, which wishes others to be endowed with happiness and the causes of happiness. So these two things, you can see they go hand in hand. And of interest here is that these are mental factors. This is not emotion, in the loose sense that, I come out of here and I see somebody in a very bad way and I'm overcome by tears and feeling. Here, you are thinking about mental factors where you have really, chewed over it. And I'll come to that later in terms of cognitive change, which is also there in the title of this. Then altruism, and the Tibetan term is laksam. Compassion is ningje. The primary interest to take responsibility to help others, where intention is key. So here you actually take responsibility that it's going to be me who's going to try and do something or will do something. And intention is very critical. You may not succeed or whatever, but this is your primary intention. And empathy is a kind of emotional resonance, but you kind of resonate with the other person's feelings, but then it is more at that level. So, but then compassion arises from empathy, but it does not remain at the level of feeling, right? So it gives you energy, sense of purpose. You are actually motivated to take some action and alleviate the suffering of others. It is not a passive state. And why is this important? Because, we just need to think about all this. And personally, as I said, it really helps me to go down. Now, compassion may be the radicalism of our times. And I'm going to talk about this because there are student protests across the world. And I am very heartened. And I want to also raise one, salams to my fellow academics across the world, because the youth is sometimes more honest, about things. I think later we learn guile. I think children are sometimes very, very, and then as you grow older. And I think there is an idealism in academia and universities in the youth at that level. So why do I call it radicalism? Because if you see these protests on campuses, and I'm not taking any particular side, I will also come to that. But I'm just arguing that, radicalism, because in 1968, you had student protests about the Vietnam War. And, that led to a lot of things. And today you see the protests about, the attacks now going into Rafah and, basically genocide, because when you think about, 70% women and children and the kind of situation that is going on and what the UN and other bodies are saying. And so shall we call compassion the radicalism of our time? Have we gone past other radicalisms like Marxism and all? Those have their own. We need to think about this, because compassion, we again think, somebody feeling like, it's a kind of emotion your grandmother would feel. But is it really what we need at every level, whether it's economic, environmental, this, that? And these students, I think for them, because we live in the age of media meaning that anybody can become a journalist, in those places, the footage that is coming out, they are seeing the suffering of those children, women, and all these, helpless, who are totally, innocent in and of themselves. And they are reacting in certain ways. And so that is compassion, right? And now they can feel that I'm sitting in the US, I'm in Ivy League universities in the best of the places. Why should I give up my degree and all? Again, going back to last time's lecture that, then from a neoclassical economics rationality sense, if I'm maximizing my self-interest, why will I give up my Columbia degree and get suspended? Or, put something on my blot on my record by standing up for people who are halfway across the world? Compassion. So is it really the radicalism of our times? And I want to say this because I think we are getting to that stage where, we need to reframe how we see this. So then here now, His Holiness says in Beyond Religion again, and I've broken up this because it's one sentence only. If we seek happiness for ourselves, we should practice compassion. And then secondarily, if we seek happiness for others too, we should practice compassion. He hasn't said secondarily, but he is first talking that if you're wanting your own happiness, please think about compassion. And then if you're wanting for others as well, let's think about it. And again, I want to discuss this because, how does one's own happiness relate to the practice of compassion? So again, for myself, personally speaking, with all due respect to all traditions like religious traditions who have compassion as a moral value, and I feel that all of them have compassion as a moral value, right? But personally speaking, for me, I would find it very daunting to think about pursuing compassion if I only saw the moral argument for it. And I again, want to give a nod to my students here. Because, for example, one of the questions that came up in this course is, ma'am, there are very special people like Mother Teresa and all, but we are not like that. And we don't think we can ever become like that either. So if we talk about cultivating compassion and all as a moral argument. And then again, my own disposition is questioning. It is of an academic bent. So I don't know how far I could go, and I may get very tired after a point if I'm thinking of a purely moral argument for compassion. So here then, at this point, though, we are talking about what is even the, how does compassion relate to our own happiness? Just forget about everybody else, because the minute we think about compassion, we think, oh, I'm going to go and make a cup of tea for my grandmom. Now I'm going to go and, do some service in the slums today. And then therefore it's going to be for them and everything. So now this, two phrases, being kind to yourself, this is, okay, happiness or pleasure as a resultant state. We discussed this last slide or the 2 slides ago. We all want that, right? And we talk about, so be kind to yourself, you want to. So here we acknowledge the part where we left last time was we said that human nature is not entirely selfish. It is not entirely compassionate or virtuous. It is where the, standard thinking today across disciplines is that perhaps we have potential for both, and we are a mix of both. So now the question comes that, it's okay to pursue your own self-interest, so what we talked about, that temporary happiness, it's fine. You need a job, you need income, you want to go for a house with a nice air condition, you want to, do some certain things, and that is completely fine. And we need to acknowledge that. And this is where we are starting. So being kind to yourself, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think I would be very irresponsible as a teacher also if I start telling my students and other people that, you go against all of that and thing. I think, we should acknowledge that we all have some part of this. But then if you think of being wisely kind to yourself, then it is not a resultant state. You are thinking of creating causes for your future and more long-term stable happiness. And for that, taking a broader view that sees your well-being as interdependent with others, as not standing alone as some hard billiard ball, stand alone, as Bertrand Russell says, then, I think many of us are slightly reluctant to make the effort, right? We want the happiness of the first kind where it is as a result. Like today, for example, what a beautiful, blessed, like here I am in Tushita. I've come here for many years. I love this place. And today I'm come here. It's, cool. It's just beautiful in this hall. And it's just such a, it's a resultant happiness. Of course, I want this. But if I think about creating causes for it, the causes may have been that there are more decade and a half, you visit here, sometimes it's 45 degrees. Sometimes you are coming back from teaching in Dadri, where my university was. I was extremely tired. I don't want to get in the roads in Delhi, blah, 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 blah. Creating causes, right? Or you are going to help, you are going to do things. These students, I would say, they are creating causes for their own future, somebody to assist them when they are in need, right? Because though they may seem completely interdependent from what is the poor children and kids and mothers in Gaza and Rafah today, right? Let's just think about that. Here we are sitting in this beautiful basement. There's more than 1 million people sitting in a small strip of land, one bathroom for more than 800 to 1,000 people. There's no water, there's no nothing, and you are scared that a bomb is going to drop. Let's put ourselves in that position just right now. So, but then these students, when they are activating this seed of compassion, and it is finally compassion, they won't agree to that word because students are a little bit, the way we associate different terms, right? Compassion, as I said, is really associated with those religious people and, people over age of 60 and all. Right? But that's what they are exhibiting. And all the adults really, little bit different anyway. So then being kind to yourself and being wisely kind to yourself. And here also, by the way, I want to a little bit just touch upon, the Buddhist philosophical notion of suffering and feeling compassion for others. I just want to set this out here, that it is not really just for of course, we feel compassion for the women and children who are dying, who are passing away, or, manifest suffering. I just drove past AIIMS. The hospital is full, right? All the patients and all that. But when we talk in Buddhist philosophy, then you think of a deeper level of suffering. So even those perhaps who today are experiencing. But the final is, seeing things as objectively real. But in this thing, the compassion we really need to feel right now is also for those who are creating causes for their own future suffering. And in that category come all the world leaders today who are inflicting a lot of pain on others. And to be honest, I find that very challenging to find compassion for them. This is one of the hardest things I personally feel. But actually, when we don't need to feel so much compassion for those who are creating the causes for their long-term happiness, or they are stably creating, but actually those who are creating causes for their future long-term suffering. And in that category, I will say today is 90% of world leaders. Because the way they are going about things and they are affecting millions of lives in a way that, has consequences. So then why practice compassion? As I was saying, it's different to the usual moral argument, right? Here, nobody is telling you that you please, become like Mother Teresa or, whoever we see as really, role models in terms of compassion, right? But the starting point should be, what do you want? Let's just start there, because let's be honest and let's also create a stable base. And if the answer is that I want my own happiness, then be compassionate. And ordinarily, like I'm saying, we link compassion to other people, like, oh, I'm going to go and look after the stray dogs. I'm going to do this. And we do somehow, and be honest with yourself. How many of you think that acting compassionately somehow detracts from your own happiness, your own time, your own energy, your own effort? Hands up. So that's how we feel, right? And it is difficult to link this compassion to your own. But if we do this, then the reason for doing this is because then when we act compassionately, it's going to be much more stable, right? Because you yourself are seeing that it is beneficial to you. So now then, how can we see that experientially? Let's try and get a taste of this a little bit here this morning. Just think about your own mental state and compare them in two situations. One, just think about, who you love most in this world. It could be your mom, your dog, your child, your whatever. And just think about, doing something little bit kind towards them or something, and just think how you felt inside. Just, think about that. And now just compare that, how have you felt when you have, somebody who's, you've had a fight, or you've really been nasty or mean or selfish, and you've just had a fight and you've been very angry with somebody. What is the feeling that do you get? What feeling have you got, right? We've all had that experience, right? Does anyone want to share here?
Sense of violation that you've not been understood. Sometimes when you had a fight,
Yeah.
your perspective is not being understood.
Exactly. So you keep thinking about that. It's like on a rewind loop, right? Even if you're eating some delicious butterscotch ice cream and all, you're like, but what happened there? And you may almost finish it and not know that it's also gone. And then did you sleep well that night, or you feel some sense of unease, right? And you generally feel that there's something, So experientially, when you just compare these and just think about it later at home and in the, what is the feeling that we would rather have 24/7? Right? And if you just think about, like, you do something. So again, we go back to Sen and Amartya Sen and all these economists who were just arguing about these things, like whether altruism is part of your own utility function or not, right? But let's think about it, like, here that, how do we feel in these two situations? And if it's us who feels better and us, forget about any moral argument. Just think about your own happiness, you just how you feel when you are going around being kind or just being, virtue states of mind, right? How you feel internally, and then how, when you are acting in these other ways that are opposite to compassion, how you feel. So if we can experientially get a taste of this, then although this goes against conventional thinking. So again, I'm warning you that the radicalism of our times is this. It's not wearing army fatigues and, whatever the posters of Che Guevara or whoever you say his name. This is it, right? So if you start thinking like this, it is going to be slightly difficult because it is not how we think. And our systems, our education systems, our upbringing, our conditionality, and not just in this life, but probably many, that also could be driving you in some other direction, right? Right after this, when I drive my car home, there'll be 50 people on Delhi roads who, it's just going to challenge your notion of, whether I should compassionately let them overtake. And I kind of forget sometimes that I'm an ordained person. So then when I look at them looking at me driving, I think I'm creating a little bit of a wrong impression. But this is unconventional thinking. So that is the definition of radical, right? So 2 questions to ponder upon. What do you or I want? Because please let us start from there. And why am I reiterating this again and again is not to be selfish, but to really think that if I'm going to stably, and I'm speaking for myself, personally speaking, like if I had to follow compassion as a moral argument, I think it would remain quite basic for me. Because as I was saying earlier, my mental disposition is such that I need a bit of convincing. And secondly, I also just don't think I would have that kind of, fervor to keep going, especially when it got challenging. But if you think about this, that how it relates to your own happiness, and it is not a moral argument being made here, then let's see if we can, just think and reflect. And then this student question, who I'll never ever forget, can I afford to be compassionate? And again, as a teacher, I cannot dismiss all these questions that, no, because it's a reality today. This is 21st century. If we look at the level of violence in society at all, and I'm not just talking physical violence, I'm talking all levels of, from economic to gender to this to that, so then here, I think the answers I gave, and I really had to reflect and think myself, is number one, that being compassionate is not being a pushover or a doormat, right? So people say that I'll be, I'll be recognized as somebody who's just kind, and then everybody will just take me for a ride, and, I'll just be seen as the biggest loser and the kind of thing. But that's why I put it out there that number one, the skillful means and skillful compassion, right? So sometimes you may be acting in ways that, you think about it. You don't, if you step out, I see somebody needing, I don't need to empty my wallet necessarily. I can think of other ways of helping. Or, you've had a bad breakup. Please don't exercise all your compassion on your ex. Think about, you need to break up if it was not a good relationship, but then keep your distance. But within that, you don't need to wish them ill and make them the biggest enemy of the state ever since you disconnected, all that kind of thing, right? And also there's something that students loved, wrathful compassion. That sometimes you outwardly appear not so sweet or kind. That may be required in certain situations. And again, in Buddhist iconography, there are also deities who exhibit wrathful compassion. But the key here is that number one, the central feature is still compassion. So that is just sometimes you need to, in order to get the situation, you may, little bit display, like say you are, is a principal of a school, you are in leadership positions, administrative, Nico is managing Tushita, there are things you need to show little bit that, you are serious about getting things done and all. So you cannot just be grinning all the time. But then whether an act is compassionate or not is judged not by the action itself, but the motivation, right? I may donate $1 million, but if, like, and I'm sorry to say this, lot of corporate social responsibility today, this pot of money that these corporations have put aside, many times the motivation is to get more business, right? If we think about Adivasi areas in India, it's a lot of times the motivation for CSR projects in those areas is to allow them to do mining, finally. Then it is not any kind of social responsibility. I'm sorry, it is quite the polar opposite. And at the same time, if you little bit, wrathful compassion, if you little bit, may show a student and all that, little bit talk tough, but your motivation is that in the long term, they have a lot of potential and they are going to go far and they need a bit of this kind of thing, then that is extremely compassionate, right? So wrathful compassion is one there. And again, in the today's context, there was a lot of questions because again, with, and that's why I was saying that these are things, let's ponder these seriously, even for the Tushita audience who may be convinced about some who have come, or for other, Dharma, Sangha, other people who are listening who are convinced about these concepts from a different perspective. Let's think about some of these questions because they are very relevant, right? And last time this lady asked that, how students and young children are facing a lot of pressure and how to, make them feel less pressure to compete, basically, because a lot of suicides in India, Kota, other places, admissions, and then like we were being honest that frankly, the structure is such that, within that, it's quite a tough job that educators have, parents have, everybody has, right? But we try our best. So I think we keep all this as open mind and not accept it as God's own truth, because here then now we are talking about universal ethics. Oh, yes. And the last very important point we made last time, that was that if we see kindness, compassion, or the whole set of virtues as being part of human and animal nature as well, then, our ethics come internally. Then we are internally driven, right? Then there's no outer external, either God or somebody else holding you account, right? Whereas if we see ourselves as being completely, selfish in the Darwinian sense or the Homo economics sense of economics and everything, then we need some external stick, either a state as a regulator or a God being who's going to judge you when you reach somewhere or something, right? So there's that big difference. So then here we are thinking now universal ethics. We are thinking that, ethics as something you are pursuing for your own happiness, your own well-being first and foremost. And it is an internal regulatory mechanism. There is nobody outside external to, either put fear into you or, even to drive you towards this good. So then summarizing some common qualms, and these are mentioned in His Holiness's writings, like, that it's only good for others, not one for oneself. So really, when you think about it, the first beneficiary of compassion is oneself. Others, whether they are benefited or not, in fact, it is not certain. Because, as we say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think that's a English phrase that doesn't completely apply here, but it does. Sometimes, your intentions are very good, but it just goes off in some other direction and everything. So, but your benefit is surely assured, and the reasonings are many because, of course, in a way, as Bertrand Russell said as well, you are focusing on something outside yourself. You are not just, constantly in your own little, the definition of depression in a way, apart from the physiological and biological reasons, is because you are completely trapped in the darkness of your own mind, right? And that is your own, the walls of your own life and existence is where the universe seems to end. So if you're thinking about others, you are, connecting to them, it brings you confidence, resilience, you are, engaged outwardly. And there is increasing evidence for this from many disciplines now. So in that way, the 21st century is amazing, right? Psychology, immunology, behavioral science, that frankly, our own health and well-being depends. And conversely, there's also research that the most people who have heart attacks and all are those who use a lot of first-person pronouns, I, me, mine, all this. So there's all this research now to back up, right, what is being said here. And the second contradiction that, compassion is only a religious identity value, as we were saying, or this misapprehension, but it's not, because even animals display it, right? And there are some wonderful videos. I my students would share all these videos. So last time we couldn't show, maybe next time, the last. But from the animal world, about compassion towards other animals. And here I have to say that, I'm starting to feel that, although human beings have immense potential, but the animal realm, I think in many ways, some qualities we have to learn from them. Like, I think they are not the, species who goes around pre-planning the kind of murderous violence that we plan, as human beings. So then here, two elements of compassion. And as I said previously, that this is, the reason I loved to study about some of these things in Buddhist philosophy is because it's so particular and so specific. And there's so much to catch hold of and, think about and chew and act on. So compassion then has two elements. One is obviously your affinity, love, and affection for the other, right? And the second is that you see their suffering and their causes of suffering, right? So here again, I want to put out two things on the second part, that, as I said, that as we did earlier for happiness, we unpacked it and we came up with a more nuanced understanding that there is that temporary, mostly related to the body, sensory perceptions, that kind of happiness, pleasure. But there is the deeper kind that is related to a mental level. So for suffering here, I would like to say that, this notion of seeing, suffering and the causes of suffering, and also feeling compassion for those who are creating their own future causes of suffering. Because I often get the question, from my academic friends and others that, that what is this? Because you see people who are flourishing, who are absolutely, as human beings, lack complete integrity and any kind of decency, and, and they are just doing phenomenally well on these dimensions of wealth, power, X, Y, Z, right? But there, I think we really need to think about, how, if we are believing, and this, as we are discussing, what is your happiness, what causes it, what leads to it, then people who are creating, though they may be the world kings right now, in that sense, leaders of countries and everything, but if you're creating causes for suffering on others, and there I would include, even maybe today in the tech gurus and all, I'm not sure. Elon Musk and this Mark Zuckerberg and all really have to think, because their downstream actions, like the numbers of kids. I have a friend's wife, they're economists, and she's working on the dark web and pedophilia and children's abuse and my God, I don't even know how she does it, because it's such a work that, so then that's downstream activity from these tech giants, right? So then I'm not having such a karma either to do for positive or negative. So they need to think about it. And we also need to, define our compassion, because let's be honest here, we feel a lot of compassion when we feel that, somebody is having manifest suffering. They are sick, they are poor, they are ill. But if we see somebody from a well-to-do family, or somebody very beautiful, or somebody in power, or somebody we just don't want to feel compassion. And right now, I think we need to find, like I'm saying today, this morning's example is the tech honchos or whatever, because they are extremely wealthy. Many of them have GDPs more than countries, and they are having this downstream effect on lives, like, somebody's kids dying and committing suicide because of online abuse and all. That's all linked back to their action. Sorry. So then we need to generate compassion, and let's also think about that. So then if we think about the levels of compassion, it's, we can think about the biological, So here, like, the most common example is really the mother for her child, or I would also add father, depends, or parent in today's modern context. And, and then extended universal compassion, right? Which is you go beyond, beyond, beyond. So now these bias feelings, like when we have, say for family members, like say, for example, siblings or friends, or, in a way that is also a little bit mixed up with attachment, right? And attachment is based on expectation, right? We've all had the experience where your best friend became your worst enemy. And in this life itself, right? Or you don't need any proof. And some people you're very close to became very distant and all that. So or people who have split up, one day the sun rose because somebody was alive and the next day you can't stand them. And you think everything is negative about them. So this thing, it's based on expectation, right? I'm attached to you as long as you are attached to me. Or in fact, many times it's even first I'm attached to you because you are attached to me, right? Or you. So, but in this category of things, so, so the child for a mother, because it's not like when the child is born, and this I'm, taking a lot of this, of course, as I've said in the bio for my talk here, I've been studying at Tippett House for a decade with Geshe Dorjit Abdullah, and this is all a lot of the teachings, that we have had. So it's not a thought that occurred to me. A child and all will feel attached to the parents because of a benefit flowing, initially, or your caregiver. How do you, form attachment, and therefore, but the mother's love is the purest example of an unconditional love, because in a way, and we can see it in our own lives. And again, just think about it. May not be your biological mother per se, could be your father, could be some other caregiver, could be some other parent figure, or somebody else who has benefited. But if for those of us who have mothers, we all do, but who have a good relationship with our mothers also, yeah, that would be the terrible logic student. If I would be disqualified straight away. We all do, but if we have a good relationship with her, or have that role model, we can see it. My father passed away in October, and one thing I realized after, and I was just thinking about it because he was a month older than His Holiness and that age group. And so the last few years he was frail and, he was not, then I just think of, whatever times, like I came back from university or I did anything and I was tired and I went to see him and my parents, but some way I would let them know I've done that. By either saying I'm very tired, or I wouldn't say it, but I'd be, or something, whereas the parents, when they do, it will just be, they'll never give you a hint. So that's unconditional, right? And His Holiness has said that his mother has been his first teacher of compassion, because he, as a child, they were a farming family, and she would take him on his back and he would pull her ears and try to direct her, basically. And, then of course in exile and all, she was there and stayed with him and all. So he says, so we humans and mammals also have a biological basis for compassion, right? So then now if we can extend this biological basis, if we can extend it gradually outwards, that is what we are talking about here. So is this a possibility or is it not? And again, here we need to think that, so the idea would be that initially our near and dear ones, however we define them, and then slowly can we go towards larger and larger groups. Like, so to be realistic, if we can then go towards slightly neutral people to whom we don't have any strong, positive or negative feeling, and then eventually towards difficult or, people. And here, of course, now again, backed by science, neuroplasticity. Now they are saying that till the day you drop dead, you can carry on, changing your wiring. And you can deliberately, so now we saw that there are two elements, this love and affection for others and seeing their suffering and everything. So if somehow we can generate this love and affection to a wider range of beings and see their suffering, then of course it's possible. And the trick here, or the key here, I would say, basically, how we see someone is obviously key to how we feel. And I'm not talking about your visual sight. I'm talking about your mental consciousness, seeing how we perceive them really. So can we change this cognitive discrimination to positive ones? And via reasoning and familiarization, not because of, just because then we can change the feeling and we can change the discrimination. And this is the bits, again, I love about like these teachings and this Nalanda philosophy, because again, it's so concrete, right? So this let's again I want to go back here because today morning I didn't check the news and everything, but I do want to bring up the, more than 1 million people in Rafah, because mentally I am thinking about them. And again, I'm saying it's not about picking one side or the other. It is speaking as a human being. And after COVID, we just came out of COVID. We came out of many things that should have chastened our behavior. These scientists are saying we've crossed the 1.5 degrees centigrade, Paris Accord and everything. We are well beyond all this, and we are going towards doom and gloom. And now we carry on. Forget now, Ukraine, Russia has gone off the map entirely. Now here we are. And right as we sit in this cool, beautiful, state of resultant happiness due to all the blessings and all our own positive actions of the past, there are these people who are sitting, 1 million of them, women, children, no water, no food. They are being pushed into famine, and the world is watching, sending them weapon supplies. And weapon supplies is ultimately linked to economic well-being, right? And they are doing all this, and who is stepping up? It is the students. And it is driven by compassion. And then the radicalism, because students are going, they are defying police, they are defying governments, they are doing all this, and a wave is catching on, and they are doing all this, they own degrees, they own, whatever. Because they are really feeling this sense of, identification with those people in Rafah. And including, I want to say, the Jewish and Israeli people, there are many of these student encampments are them right there, right? So they are having an identification with the Palestinians in Rafah as a common humanity, our interdependence. They are not seeing them as these, other beings that we have to just exterminate and do something. And so these two principles, this common desire, we are humans or animals, or, there's sentience there, and we want happiness, we want suffering, and we are interdependent, and we share something in common. We don't have the differences in religion, in color, in gender, caste, economic standing. Just take out the whole list. But rather we share something common, and that is this. And that is what is pushing these students to, do all this. So here I have to share that this course, actually, it was much harder to teach than my regular economic subjects that I taught in the IR department. But the students, it was full up, 40 on 40 every year, fill up. And they are much more in touch with me years after, because they, it's things that. So if we break up the steps, it is the sense of identification. Then they feel this affection, feeling of closeness, because they feel that, I may be sitting in Columbia campus, I may be having a beautiful, wonderful morning in, Cambridge or Boston or wherever it is. And there are these people, right? And a concern, empathic, we said you resonate with the feelings of others. I don't have water, I don't have a bathroom, I don't have food. I'm like, no hospitals, you've destroyed all our systems of medical care and everything. Then I have some intention to act, right? So the point here is that, then now today we'll touch upon using psychology as a tool, because again, as we said, now since we are just trying to think of various ways, and because, it may not be that easy, and we also wish to extend this ever greater levels. So what are the tools we can use? Because we said that, here we are relying on these reasoning, familiarization. So then using psychology like this, with every primary mind, we have 5 omnipresent mental factors: contact, attention, discrimination, feeling, and intention. And these are with every moment of mind. So we come into contact with an object. And by the way, these are simultaneous, but when they are causal, they are sequential. And I won't get into that. We can discuss later for those who are, But you come into contact, you pay attention to something, you then discern the discriminating part, the cognitive part, that, okay, this is that, whatever. Then some feeling is going to come to you, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And then you have some kind of intention, which is some movement of the mind, some push, pull, or neutral. So this is how the kind of, mind works. So can we manipulate this now, driving this cognitive change for compassion, right? So going back, if compassion is a mental factor of love, it's a mind which wishes others to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So here then, And we said that now we are not just talking about biological compassion, mother, child for parents, parents for child, all that, and there I just forgot to say one point, that actually if we start training in compassion, initially it might be like, the child thinks of their parents as somebody benefiting them and all, right? Then that kind of love, but slowly over time, it can become the other way, the unconditional that the parent sort of feels. And let's just check and examine our minds, because really you can even see that in your own lives and how we live it now. So I'm talking here to people who have old parents who they are taking care of and everything, right? And you just think back to your childhood when, they never told you that we don't have space in the car for the third child, so we'll just leave you behind. And we sometimes, when we take care of old parents, we let them know subtle way, oh, I have to move across the world, this happened, that happened, right? So there. So check all these things. It's not just words, because sometimes I feel myself after 10 years, 15 years that, sometimes the words, it's taken me a decade to percolate some little bit of meaning, because sometimes the words seem a little bit, different, like just in English especially. So then extending this compassion, first you're near and dear, then neutral, and then finally difficult, So then the compassion, we said, then it's a mental factor which is accompanied by this intention to embrace, right? Those students in, the US are really wanting to, basically the intention is to kind of embrace, come closer. The people in Rafah, Gaza, they are, they are not pushing away and everything. They are pulling towards that we are standing together with you. And this intention is determined by the feeling, right? So why feeling? If they saw them as completely other, right? If we see, like today also in India, the kind of violence we exert on other communities, other castes, other economic classes of being, right? And my God, the human cruelty also is on a different scale. And why? Because the feeling we get when we see them is completely, this, like, I have nothing in common. Like, this person is, whatever, black, or this low caste person, or this poor, or this, that, or this female, whatever, So these, but then here the feeling is like they are identifying with them. They are going to stand. And that feeling is determined how you discriminate. So discriminate here is not in the English sense of the word, like you discriminate against somebody, but how you discern, how you finally decide what something is, right? So the key question here then is that how do you perceive neutral beings and difficult beings so that the pleasant feeling arises and you are in some ways pulled by them? You want to embrace them. And I want to take a moment to pause here, because again, let's go back to that example of the person who was in Chinese CCP incarceration for decades, right? And he says, I was feeling a danger. And what is the danger? That I'm in danger of losing my compassion, right? So this is not that easy to achieve. He has achieved this. You see, the most difficult beings, your enemy, they've, stolen your country, they've destroyed the monasteries, they've disrobed the monastics and done everything. And then you are still getting a kind of a okayish feeling, and you are feeling compassion towards them. So that's a very high level, but here we can feel a lot of hope, because we can all get there. Because we are all thinking about our own potential, which is infinite. We are all thinking that this is also our potential, our responsibility. There's no one out there to either stick to you, judgment day or whatever, in that sense of, somebody judging, or that's the reason that you're behaving in certain ways. And at the same time, our own potential, and trying to see that. So then there are many, like, little bit of bag of tricks in your bag, or like tools, because, we can use different ones on different, depending, and you have to train. And because, this is something we can all intellectually, and, why people may wonder how I am academically, I am an academic, I'm a professor, and then I've gone in certain directions because of the complete magnetic pull of the Nalanda tradition. because it has led me in a direction that the reasons, like the reasons why I first went from mainstream economics to political economy, and now the dial has gone to Nalanda tradition, because I felt it's also intellectually dishonest to keep doing that. Particularly in my area where we talk about development and, the whole idea is to help others. And also, of course, the classroom is there, and that's a big area of activity. And that, as I'm saying, I hail all the students that are protesting, all the teachers who have taught them, all the academics have written and put their own selves in positions of danger, and also, giving up things because they see some things as being very, very central and important. And that's the motivation for being academics or teachers and all. It's never about the salary or about the this or the that. But here I've arrived at this point because I feel that the world today, when you think about this, so the various tools in which we can change our mind and therefore through reasoning, and then gain complete conviction. And then that is so stable, like this person in Chinese incarceration, that is so stable that no matter what you confront, you are His Holiness the Dalai Lama, living an example. All the modern nation states in the world are not able to stand up to China, and he is. That's it. So the point is that, we can also get there ourselves. So then one of the things, compassion practice, one of the tools is that the more you see the causes for a person or community's negative actions, right? Then the more you start divorcing the community itself or the person from the action. They may be doing this, like, so for example, again, I'm qualifying. It is the CCP or something. It is not all Chinese. Or you see the causes that maybe initially, the formation of a statehood or something, or what are the causes behind, an individual or a person's actions, and try to, then you see it a bit differently, how you apportion the blame. You see the relativity of things, again, not easy. Somebody's, just beaten you or banged into your car, and then you think, okay, it could have been worse. They could have killed me, or not easy. Especially not in Delhi, where in Khan Market, somebody actually killed somebody a few years ago for their car parking. It was the other way around. Then you can think interdependence, and that is really wisdom, and that is cognition. So here again, why I love so much, nothing namby-pamby, have faith in this, do that, do this. It is just you use your own reasoning. You think about interdependence. You think about what these students are asking for is divestment, because they are linking the war to the money flow, to the power, to all these things. Interdependence. So we start thinking about that, again, you can generate compassion. You can also act in ways depending. And the subtlest, of course, because today we've spoken a lot about the epistemological side, or working on your mind, on, the psychological part of the compassion thing. But one other trick is to see the nature of reality. And that may be the final trick in the box. And for that will be the next session, the last session, the movie advertisement. Because there I want to talk about really why, if we, if we use cognition, if we see the nature of reality, the ontological reality, interdependence in that context, then our capacity for compassion has no bounds. Then it is stable as, the biggest mountain, and its potential is just infinite. And that is where we want to get to, because I think it is the radicalism of our times. And I would like to end here with an extract from Saint Saraha. He was the teacher of Arya Nagarjuna Gompolundup, his teacher, a great first century master, superb academic. To fathom any of his teachings, you need to, carry out hundreds of other studies. So he says, by entering into emptiness, which is interdependence, we can say, also is. But devoid of compassion, one will not find the supreme path. At the same time, by meditating upon compassion alone, one will not attain liberation, but remain in samsara. whosoever is capable of grasping the unity of the two will not remain in samsara nor abide in personal nirvana. So he says this, and we will discuss. Next session will actually be a little more targeted towards people who have been exposed to philosophy for a bit and have an interest also. But of course, anybody can, most welcome. And, but for me personally, I want to again argue that why I feel that the development of compassion has no bounds here is because when you go into the nature of ontological reality and shift through analytical reasoning and perspective, then that is a change that you will never come back from. Then also your capacity on the method side becomes very, very stable and profound. So with that, I would really like to dedicate and thank. We'll take Q&A, but before we do that, I would just like to thank once again Nico for inviting me to this beautiful, blessed center. I would like to dedicate for the swift return of Kyabje Zopa Rinpoche. There are many beings who have, again, through interdependence, the force of the karma, the force of the aspirations, and the force of the absolutely different level of compassion, brought many things into being, and this center is one of them. And I pray for his swift return to guide us. Many of you have just been in Kopan and Nico as well. And so we pray for that. And I would also like to dedicate for the long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all our teachers and guides, for all centers that are speaking and discussing and putting out, the Nalanda tradition and these kind of, teachings and trainings that are so very necessary in today's world, in a secular way and in any other way. May they always flourish, the big monastic universities and all of them. And may all of us, as quickly as possible, reach our final goals of becoming enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. Jang Chop Sam Cho Kren Po Che Ma Ke Pa Nam Ke Go Che Ke Pa Nam Pa Me Pa Yang Gong Ne Gong Du Pel War Shok. Throughout my future lifetimes, may I be guided by the compassionate Buddha and be able to uphold the two precious bodhicittas even at the cost of my life. If there's any Q&A, I'm happy to take.
Hi, Kaveri. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, but I can't see you.
Okay. Well, I'm not. It's a bit early for me. I had a late night, so I'm not coming on the camera. I'm not dressed for it. So I took down a few notes. I have a few questions on compassion. I've been a student like you have been for quite a while, and I've been thinking about a lot of things, other than what I've learned through Buddhism. So I'll start off by saying that, a lot of the things that Buddhism tells us, the first thing we learn is that, Buddha says that you have to test what I'm saying, test it like gold. And none of the things that there is one basis of everything in this philosophy, which is karma. And if you kind of attack that, then everything falls like a deck of cards. So, and nothing is proven about karma. It's like, it's a cop-out when they say that, karma is like, it's a hidden phenomena, it's this and that. So when you give examples of like downstream activity, like, so when we've not even proved karma, any talk of any downstream activity by like Elon Musk or anything, it loses its significance because what has to be proven hasn't been proved yet. So then talking about any consequence that arises therefrom, is irrelevant. So that is one aspect of
Can
it, which
I respond to that? I'll respond to that, Simal.
No, because let me just frame my whole question. I'll just take 2 minutes.
Okay. You're still part of the question, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the first part of it is, karma. Then the second thing is that, like when we talk about compassion, we talk about skillful means, but skillful means is nothing. In Buddhism, there is an antidote for everything. But skillful means has no meditation, no antidote, no nothing. Skillful means is nothing but a resourcefulness which is honed by real world understanding and experience in decision making. So that can only be exercised by acting in the world and understanding the motivations of other people, which may or may not arise from compassion, can arise from self-interest. So to even empathize with self-interest, one has to know self-interest. So, and like when we talk about Gaza, for example,
You have a
right?
pen. Can I just summarize, because I don't have a pen and paper, so I'd like to respond to each part. So if I just can respond to these two first, is
Okay.
that possible? Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah,
the
okay, but
first,
I just
yeah.
would end up asking a lot of questions. I mean,
Yeah,
if
no, I
we
want
do
to
it,
just respond to these because it's important, and then we can take the next part on. So the
okay.
first I want to say that, you use the word Buddhism, but I have actually in this talk kept it to universal ethics. So the first part I want to say is that actually, and I want to set this out here very clearly because His Holiness is actually arguing, and a lot of the work that I have presented here from his is called Beyond Religion. So if we put Buddhism as a ism, which it is, nowhere here is there any mention of Buddhism. And the reason for that, as I set out, I don't know if you heard the first talk, but it was also, I started with, basically the context for this actually very interesting, Simar, is that when I was proposing to teach this course in my university, one of my colleagues actually said that this is a great idea, but don't use the B word. And he meant Buddhism. And I also thought, and I understood in a heartbeat, His Holiness's skillfulness for wanting to put universal ethics and secular ethics into curriculums at university levels at. So in the last talk, as I said, as His Holiness says, in Beyond Religion, his book is titled that. He says that, water of spirituality or values or universal ethics is essential. Religion is tea. So Buddhism in that sense is something that is not mentioned here at all. Coming next to karma. Again, when you talk about it in this sense of in the Buddhist, in the deepest and all the many categories of karma, that is not something here that I have brought up, or there is neither a requirement for belief in it. All we need here is a belief in cause and effect. And there I have suggested, like, particularly that, we check it in our own lives through these experiences and through all of this. So in fact, nowhere here am I suggesting, and in fact, it was pitched, I appreciate that there are people here who have been studying Buddhism for a long time, such as yourself. But it is not making an argument that is based on that. In fact, it is the polar opposite. Because I would think that I would want people to go away from here thinking about this due to all the reasonings given, such as, for example, their own happiness and our own experiential understanding of that. So that is the first part of the question. And the second, what was it, Sima? What was the second one, Nico? No, that was part of the first. Oh, yes, skillful means. Yes, yes. Yeah, skillful means, yes, of course. I mean, what you're saying is true, to be in the world. Yes, of course. The whole talk has been based, a lot of it addressed from an economics to an economist to others, very much students, people who are in the world. And self-interest, of course, that was a starting point, even in fact, for the practice of compassion. Even for that, I've argued that, what we really need to start off is our own motivation, our own happiness. What do we want? So you are saying that for skillfulness, and it's just resourcefulness by another name. And actually, it involves being part of the world and one's own self-interest. So yeah, that part I would argue. But beyond that, I feel skillfulness can go very, very, very deep. Right? And but again, it can encompass both these sides of, seeing our human nature, the potential for selfishness and for having ulterior motives and everything, but also for having virtue in its purest form. So, yeah. Yes. Now, the Gaza, please. I don't think he's there. is not? Okay. Okay. Yes, please.
May I ask? Oh,
This time. But there is one that is much closer to us here in India,
Yeah.
which is almost of the same amplitude,
Mm-hmm.
which are the Rohingya, who have been displaced. 1 million
Yes.
people who have
Yes.
been displaced by populations that believe in Buddhism
Yes.
and who chase them by destroying their house and their village since 7 years ago.
Absolutely.
This population is slowly starting to lose hope,
Mm-hmm.
radicalizing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a huge potential to become one of the new, what I would say, melting pot of hatred,
Yes.
violence,
Yes.
and hopelessness.
Yes.
And I just wonder, as the Dalai Lama kindness, why would not it be possible to also address his Buddhist community
Mm-hmm.
as member of the same faith,
Faith.
to tell them that the need of compassion
Mm-hmm.
also envelope
Yes.
faith is minority, it is Muslim minority, it is.
Perfect.
Because otherwise the consequence will be disastrous for everyone.
Perfect.
We will perpetuate the cycle of violence.
Yes. What's your name, please? Pierre. So Pierre has asked a question about the Rohingyas and said that that is an example much closer to home. Similarly, as I gave about, Gaza and Rafah. So I would completely agree with Pierre. And in fact, it's absolutely true. And I could give countless other examples, from within India. And last time I avoided some. I want to reiterate here once again that, I'm not giving these examples from a political position per se, but due to the humanitarian, our common humanity. So as Pierre says that when the Rohingya question comes and a Buddhist community, why are they not acting in ways? So I would like to again quote His Holiness, where he actually, when he sets out the reasoning, I don't have that quote. I took it out of this presentation, but he basically says that why is he arguing for beyond religion? Because he says while religions have the possibility and even the mandate for inculcating compassion, he says for the last 1,000 years, they have often not. And he is also talking about Buddhism in that he is all, no exceptions. So in fact, this also relates to Simmer's question and anybody else's who still has this. So I would completely agree with you that, he says that religious, and he's actually said in that quote that it's actually led to the opposite, right? So therefore, we have to look for other bases of values. And therefore, he has come up with these universal values. And also, Pierre, for His Holiness, as you know, they are refugees in India, right? They themselves are not in a homeland or in any kind of situation to start raising, But as I'm saying that this question, therefore, we take it out of the religious, that I would say religion, in a way, it's our personal business. And His Holiness has said this even about Buddhism. He said there is the philosophy, there is the there are all these things that all of us that we can all think about, right? But the religious part of it, the part that is somebody's personal business, right? And it is true for all religions, I would say. And in fact, I would say that part, if we can remain, because some of the biggest wars in history and even today are on religious grounds. And why does His Holiness have as his second commitment after universal ethics is interreligious harmony? And why does he use the word harmony? Because we are obviously going around killing each other in the name of religion. So nobody's let off the hook, Pierre. And therefore, I have not anywhere spoken about any religion here. Yes. Yeah.
It should be selective or we should have a holistic approach. Because what we are seeing now in Gaza, Rafah, and in those part of the world, and there are a lot of protests all across the globe in some small cities or the field we call it. But those same people who are protesting now for this particular event, they were not doing the same few months back.
Yeah.
Armenia or other
Yes.
happened when the Nagorno-Karabakh was taken by Azerbaijan.
Yes,
Or
yes.
They were not protesting on the same length and breadth.
What's your name, sorry? Agnivesh. So Agnivesh had a question about, you know, the selectivity of compassion and that the student protests now, like they didn't stand up for other, you know, same time. In the last year, many other such situations where they have not, you know, stood with them more, you know, and so there also I would agree, Agnivesh. I would say two things. I would say I've also been thinking about it. I mean, firstly, is our kind of attention span as human beings. I think it goes very quickly, right? It's the next thing, next thing, next thing. Second, there is a structural kind of blind spot, like when we think of Sudan, when we think of many, right? And there also color and many other criterias come into, you know. So people, you know, Ukraine, Russia, is it a part of Europe? Is Europe thinking about its own interests vis-a-vis all of that? And then in this case, so those factors, I completely agree with you, and large parts of the world. In fact, I would say the Tibetan question, you know, because of His Holiness, it has stayed alive. But to be honest, otherwise, you know, nowadays, so many of those factors, absolutely agree. The third point I would say is that this Gaza Rafah, I think because of the nature of technology now, like thankfully, in a way, it was working positive also, right? Because anybody can upload images and everything. And I think the nature of it, that it's quite sustained, and the numbers of women, children, maybe that is what has, you know, really caught on as, you know, something that students at least are not unwilling to, you know, sort of like, or they finally thought about, you know. And the last thing that, yes, I would agree, selectivity, but then perhaps we feel that sometimes our energies may be directed to one or two things, right? Not this example that you are saying, that students protesting about every single thing, but I would say that in our own lives, sometimes we give emphasis to 3-4 projects, or we kind of specialize in a way, right? Rather than, you know, so that factor could also be there. Yeah. Absolutely, your point is right. And the hope is that if we think about these things more and in a sustained way, slowly there is an extension of this feeling, right? I think we are getting to a stage in the world where we will really require that. It's going to become a necessity, because there are so many disasters in all directions, and all the time, every second day, you open something massive and new, right? And there's fatigue. And that fatigue we've talked about, like if the basis is not very stable and sound, then again, we've all tendency to feel it. But I also feel that the human species, like I'm saying, after COVID and everything, again, we are back to our old tricks with all these violence. So that, yes. So thank you, Anuj, for your question. So Anuj is saying that, there are two competing philosophies of like compete and destroy or create and depend. And he says that, is there a possibility for the latter, which is obviously um, far less powerful or whatever, to sort of make a dent in the former? And I would completely agree with you, Anuj, in the sense that I do feel that the Bretton Woods institutions, I talked about that last time, like the UN and everything was formed in the post-war context in Europe, right? Because they've been through the world wars, they've seen all that destruction, they want to create peace and a stable situation. So all these institutions, all the UN institutions, but also the World Bank, IMF, everything. And then they create their own systems. Now, I think we are at a stage in world economics, geopolitics, all of this, where that has to be revisited. Because I think that the breakdown of democratic societies, especially with the coming of tech and the fourth industrial revolution, the tech revolution, which is going to change things, starting with our democracies. Forget about any social implications. And secondly, I feel with AI and everything, there's frontiers coming now post-truth society in a way we are living in, including the economics part of it. And as you're saying, they are very powerful. I think, of course, Oxfam does a study every year. The top billionaires, they are going up, like the trend is like that. GDP more than many countries. And so they are very powerful, the Davos and everything, that group, right? And they are going to try to reproduce their wealth and hold on to it. But I think the situation is such that economically and then geopolitically now, with the breakdown of democratic functioning all over the world, frankly, it's not just the global south or the emerging powers and everything, right? It's happening en masse in a lot of places. The rise of the far right, which is linked to economic opportunity and everything as well. So I feel that I was chatting to an academic friend that, we need to rewrite a lot of academic theories, frankly, that 100 years ago now is past, is coming on to, like, it's time to revisit. Because, and when you talk about the climate, of course, we know the destruction, for example, of the ecosystem or whatever. As I'm saying, these climate scientists are themselves saying that, so they are in a way harking to what you are saying, that the compete and destroy, we can't stop them. Whether it's private individuals or nation states, they are just carrying on. And now it's a kind of an end game. But I think this thing of, create and depend, I think, we might be forced to. And here, so then again, the hope is like His Holiness has in the youth. And I feel that they are going two ways. One, to educate them, because that possibility at the school level, university levels, that I really do feel. And I feel who people in the abstract say that millennials are this, the Gen Z is this and all this. Actually, it's not true. Extremely bright, extremely. And in fact, they are becoming much more, in Tushita in Dharamsala, I met some young, they had introductory course, and there were very young people from Europe, like 23 and all. And I was asking them that, what is it like in your generation? And they were saying we are one of two extremes. Either we are complete hedonist and, materialist and everything, or we are completely in the other track. They had trekked all the way from Austria or Germany or somewhere alone to India. His parents had let him. So 23. So the thing is that I feel that this generation is going to have to confront these things, and they have also be equipped. So maybe then they are the ones who are going to, take it forwards. I think Joyji had a hand up, Minothila, and then we can take. Joyji, you had a question?
Yes, I had, am I audible? I'm audible? I couldn't hear anyone's questions. Oh, okay. So very quickly, we have studied Buddhism for some time. We've taken various vows, so we do call ourselves Buddhist. But, one thing about it is that karma is shared by so many Asian religions. I would say including Islam.
Oh, we
And
lost you.
humanity,
We
the other
lost
end
you
of
in
the
the middle,
judgment day,
Joyji. Sorry, we lost you. What did you say? Karma is what?
I said karma is accepted by many Indian religions, not just Buddhism. It's
Yeah.
not just Hinduism, Jainism, I would say Sikhism also, and Islam, and even Christianity. The people of the book have this idea of, final judgment day and things like that. But what I wanted to say as a so-called practitioner, can you hear me? Okay. I have a feeling that when we get into the reasoning of things, why we do things, like, what can I do, one individual, whether I'm working in a coal mine, in a tribal area where people, what can I do? And this I would just reason. I would end up reasoning that I can't do anything.
Joyji, we are losing you in the middle. Yeah, can you write your question to Nico, please, and he'll share it?
Because
We are
the
losing
odds
you.
against an individual or society, it's great. Okay. Saying karma.
Your voice is breaking up. If you can just message Nico.
Oh, okay.
Minotila. Sorry. No, I think thank you. Minotila was just saying about, that it's good to give students, like, I mean, as I spoke positively about students today and also sharing her experiences as principal of a school. And it's so timely you're saying this, Minotila, because yesterday Geshala was telling some people who came, somebody else who works in a school about your school and his experience coming to speak to the class 6. And he was saying that every question or everything he said, they had already anticipated 2 further questions and they were 12 years old or something like. So I think working with students, so it's again interdependence, right? I think actually that's the part I really love the most about being an academic, is to interact with students, because actually there is a lot of hope there. And, there's really the ones to, because I think adults, frankly, after a point, they become very tired. Not all, I have to qualify, but like, unless you are really working on it. So, yeah. Nick, leave it on. Okay, okay. Okay, okay, okay. Okay. So then, Joyji's question came? No? I think, Joyji, I think maybe if I just paraphrase, I couldn't hear you, but I think you were asking about karma being accepted in a lot of Indic and other even non-Indic religions. And then you were saying about, this thing of acting like one individual. I think you were talking about your work in Chhattisgarh and all, right? And you were saying how uphill it is and what degree to which you have agency. Is that what you were asking? Because we can't hear you.
I sent a message, what I was asking about. Can you hear me now? I sent
If
a
you say
message.
it quickly, okay, Nico hasn't received. If you send it quickly, then we can.
Oh, I
respond.
sent it to Tenzin Wusel.
Oh, no.
Okay, so I said I could,
If you just
I
quickly share the
find I
question.
just shortened it.
Yeah.
I've been asking myself, what is it as a so-called practicing Buddhist? What is it that the Palestinians have done to collective genocide be taking place on them? I sometimes feel that they cannot escape the karma that they've created collectively in some other
Okay.
life. That's a fault.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I here have resisted Joyji to talk about, I'm not keen to talk about any particular religious belief here. So I think that, I think precisely for the reasons that His Holiness has set out and everything, that, if we talk about cause and effect, and if we just see it as operating in our day-to-day lives, and, I think at that level, because he himself has said in his book that, whether it's theistic or non-theistic religions, a lot of the proofs and everything goes into the metaphysical realm and all. And so these are the reasons why he has proposed universal ethics. So that was the starting point, and that's where I would like to leave this talk, because it is not really about, people's beliefs about this and that. That's a private business, and it is very worthy, but people's own business. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You are bound by your organizations and the rules and regulations. So it's not always in your hands.
Yes.
It is there for all the nations.
Absolutely. What is your name? Praveen. So Praveenji, what you were saying is exactly in a way what Minoti is saying. She's of course heading an institution, so it's a different cup of tea, but it's still same principle, right? So the thing is that I think again in this, it's very important to take responsibility. And this comes back to Simmer's question on skillful means. I think that when whatever position, lowest to highest, if we have something, and not position in the sense of a post, but wherever we are active or have the possibility, we do have a responsibility to try and engage. And because I think that if all the people who have integrity and all withdraw, then in a way, we've given up the game. And in fact, I met some older person who was really berating our generation in India. She's like, your generation just took for granted about leadership and democracy and everything. And none of you went into politics. And we said that I mentally did a little prostration of gratitude. But what I mean to say is that in all jobs, and trust me, I mean, even academic admin and all, I raise one to Minotiji, because honestly, it's not something I personally at all have an inclination. It is tough. It is not easy. But then I think it's very worthwhile. And the people, if you are ever put in those positions, whatever the positions now, Nico's taking charge of all the programs here and everything, it's work, right? But then, if you can, I think we have a responsibility. And there, like you're saying, we are bound. So skillful means then how do you still maneuver, cajole? There, what Simmer said has a point. Sometimes it's like really little chantu. Or you are seeing the bigger good, and therefore you are going along with some smaller something. All that, for sure. But I think it comes back to what is your motivation? and what is your thing. And then like I would even tell a lot of my friends who are politics friends, like student politic, academic, I would say, this is the most childish that everybody will resign. What is this? They'll just fill up your post. Goodbye. Game over. You have to be in the game. Then you do this, that, maybe you have then of course you need again a little bit of, view of interdependence and compassion to relax your mind. If you don't, it's personally very difficult. But I think that's what it is. Absolutely. And if you get a chance to become somebody's boss and all, do take it. If you have things to contribute and integrate, because I do feel it is true that if all the good people and the virtuous and the ones who have greater interests, if they just, withdraw, then you're leaving the field open. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Let's take a short moment to thank Venerable Tenzin Russell Monkey for accepting to share her vast knowledge at Tushita, and especially how to develop compassion and how to transform our mind and transform our discrimination to generate more compassion. And I'm really much looking forward to next week's session to learn about interdependence and the wisdom of emptiness. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank all of you for joining online as well. Many left for lunch already, but thank you very much for joining. And so the next session with Venerable will be also next Saturday at 11 a.m. And in the meantime, we have different programs. Every morning, Monday to Friday, we have a guided meditation at 9 a.m. That's only online at the moment, 9 to 9:30, a short guided meditation. And on Tuesday, we'll have a puja here. You're most welcome to join. We'll do it online as well. And please join our WhatsApp group for more updates. You'll find the QR code in the staircase. And one other thing I would like to mention is that Tushita is entirely run based on donations, meaning that the programs we organize and taking care of the place and the rent and so forth is entirely due to the generosity of the people who come here and the people who follow online. And you might have noticed people who joined last week, we had a power cut. At the moment, we need to replace the battery of the inverter, so this had a cost. And yeah, today we have a part of Tushita without light. We also need to call the electrician. So yeah, thank you in advance for your generosity. Those who are online on our website, there is a way to donate. And here we have a box at the back and also a QR code there on the wall. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you.